The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of the Windsor estate as Charles adjusted his tie for the third time. His reflection in the antique mirror showed a man wrestling with a decision that had been brewing for months. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times, its deep resonance matching the weight in his chest. Kate had always been different from the others who married into the family. She possessed a quiet strength that reminded Charles of his late mother, a grace under pressure that commanded respect without demanding it. But, lately, he had witnessed something that troubled him deeply: the systematic undermining of Kate's confidence by someone who should have been her ally. The previous evening's dinner had been the final straw. Charles had watched from across the mahogany table as Camilla made another cutting remark about Kate's parenting choices, disguised as helpful advice, but delivered with surgical precision. The younger woman's face had remained composed, but Charles caught the brief flicker of hurt that crossed her features before she expertly masked it with a polite smile. "Your Majesty," his private secretary knocked softly before entering. "The Queen Consort is requesting an audience before the family meeting." Charles straightened his shoulders. He knew what this meant. Camilla had sensed the shift in his demeanor and was preparing her defense. For years, he had chosen peace over confrontation, allowing small cruelties to pass unchallenged in the name of family harmony. But watching Kate's light dim incrementally had awakened something protective in him that he could no longer ignore. The meeting was supposed to be routine, discussions about upcoming engagements, charity work, and public appearances. But Charles had other plans. He had spent the morning reviewing notes he had been quietly keeping, documenting incidents that individually seemed trivial but together painted a disturbing picture of deliberate psychological warfare. As he walked through the portrait-lined corridors toward his study, Charles reflected on the irony of his situation. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, yet he had allowed his wife to terrorize his daughter-in-law through 1,000 small cuts. The realization that his silence had been complicity struck him with unexpected force. Kate arrived first, as she always did, punctual to a fault, and carrying herself with the dignity that had made her beloved by the public. She wore a simple navy dress that emphasized her natural elegance, her hair pulled back in a style that revealed the determined set of her jaw. Charles noticed the slight shadows under her eyes and wondered how many sleepless nights his inaction had cost her. "Good morning, Charles," she said warmly, though he detected a wariness that hadn't been there when she first joined the family. "Kate, my dear," he replied, his voice carrying more weight than usual. "I'm glad you're here early. There's something important I need to discuss with everyone today." Before Kate could respond, the sound of heels clicking against marble announced Camilla's arrival. She swept into the room with her characteristic confidence, her smile bright, but her eyes calculating as they moved between Charles and Kate. Behind her came William, his face showing the strain of recent weeks. "Good morning, darling," Camilla said, kissing Charles's cheek before turning to Kate with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Kate, you look tired. Perhaps you should consider taking a break from some of your commitments." The comment landed exactly as intended, a suggestion that appeared caring but carried the implication that Kate wasn't handling her responsibilities well. Charles felt his jaw tighten as he watched his son's wife maintain her composure despite the obvious sting of the remark. William moved protectively closer to Kate, his hand finding hers in a gesture that spoke volumes about the strain this situation was placing on the younger couple. Charles realized with a pang of guilt that his son had been fighting this battle alone, trying to shield his wife from attacks while maintaining respect for his stepmother. "Actually," Charles said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "Kate has been handling her responsibilities magnificently. In fact, her dedication and grace under pressure have been exemplary." Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across her features at the unexpected praise. She had grown accustomed to Charles remaining neutral in these subtle exchanges, his silence serving as tacit approval of her behavior. "Of course," Camilla recovered quickly, her tone slightly cooler. "I simply meant that we all need to pace ourselves. The demands of royal life can be overwhelming, especially for those who weren't born into it." The barb was expertly delivered, another reminder of Kate's commoner origins wrapped in concern. But this time, Charles was ready. "You're absolutely right," he said, standing slowly and moving to the window that overlooked the gardens where his grandchildren often played. "The demands are indeed overwhelming, which is why it's crucial that we support each other rather than tear each other down." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Camilla's face went very still, her social smile freezing as she processed the implications of his words. William squeezed Kate's hand, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Charles turned back to face the room, his expression grave but resolute. Which brings me to the real purpose of today's meeting. We need to address some issues that have been festering for far too long. The transformation in Camilla was immediate and striking. The carefully maintained facade of the concerned stepmother cracked, revealing something harder underneath. Her voice rose slightly as she spoke. Charles, I hardly think this is the time or place for whatever dramatic gesture you're contemplating. We have important matters to discuss. But Charles had already made his choice. The silence he had maintained for too long was about to be broken, and nothing Camilla could say would penetrate the protective barrier he was finally raising around Kate. The young woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes had brightened with something that might have been hope. For the first time in months, she wasn't standing alone against the subtle cruelties that had been chipping away at her confidence. William's relief was palpable as he realized his father was finally going to address the elephant in the room that had been destroying his wife's peace of mind. The burden of being the sole defender of his family was about to be shared. As Charles prepared to speak the words that would change everything, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking the moment when silence would no longer be an option. Charles moved away from the window, his footsteps deliberate as he crossed the Persian rug to his desk. He withdrew a leather portfolio that Camilla had never seen before, its contents representing weeks of careful observation and documentation. The weight of it in his hands felt like vindication for every moment he had witnessed Kate's quiet suffering. For the past 6 months, Charles began, his voice steady but carrying an authority that brooked no interruption. I have been watching and listening. What I have observed deeply concerns me. Camilla's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She attempted to interject with a laugh that sounded forced and brittle. Charles, really, whatever you think you've seen, I think I've seen enough. He cut her off firmly, opening the portfolio. Kate, I owe you an apology. I have failed in my duty to protect a member of this family from systematic undermining and deliberate cruelty. Kate's composure finally cracked slightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had carried the burden of these attacks alone for so long that hearing them acknowledged felt like a dam breaking inside her chest. William's grip on her hand tightened, his own emotions clearly running high. This is absolutely ridiculous, Camilla snapped, her voice rising dangerously. I have done nothing but try to help Kate adjust to royal life. If she's too sensitive to handle constructive criticism? Charles's voice carried a sharp edge that made everyone in the room go still. Is that what you call telling her that her charity work lacks sophistication? That her parenting style is too indulgent? That she should consider stepping back from public duties because she's clearly overwhelmed? Each accusation hit Camilla like a physical blow. She had been so careful, so subtle in her campaign to diminish Kate's confidence that she hadn't realized Charles was paying such close attention. Her face flushed red as she struggled to maintain her innocence. You're taking things out of context, she protested, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. A stepmother has a right to offer guidance. A stepmother has a responsibility to support and nurture, Charles corrected sharply. Not to systematically destroy someone's self-confidence through a campaign of psychological warfare. The words hung in the air like an accusation at a trial. William had never heard his father speak so directly about family conflict, and the relief on his face was evident. He had been fighting this battle alone, watching his wife retreat more each day under the constant barrage of subtle attacks. Kate found her voice for the first time since the confrontation began. I tried to be understanding, she said quietly, her words barely above a whisper, but carrying enormous weight. I know this transition hasn't been easy for anyone, but I never expected to be made to feel like an outsider in my own family. Camilla's eyes flashed with something dangerous. The careful mask she had worn for years was slipping, revealing the calculating woman beneath. You've been whispering poison in his ear, she accused Kate directly, abandoning all pretense of civility. Turning him against me with your victim act. The accusation was so outrageous that William started to rise from his chair, but Charles held up a hand to stop him. The king's face had gone cold as ice, his eyes boring into Camilla with an intensity that would have silenced a room full of courtiers. Kate has never spoken a word against you to me, Charles said with deadly calm. Every observation in this file comes from my own witness. Every cruel remark, every dismissive comment, every attempt to undermine her confidence. I saw it all myself. He opened the portfolio and began reading from his notes, his voice clinical but devastating. October 15th, during the charity gala planning meeting. Perhaps Kate should focus on smaller, more manageable events until she develops better organizational skills. October 22nd, at the family dinner. It's admirable how Kate tries so hard to fit in, though some things simply can't be taught. November 3rd, stop. Camilla's voice cracked like a whip through the room. Her composure had completely shattered, revealing the fury beneath. You have no right to put me on trial like this. I am your wife. And Kate is family, Charles replied implacably. A beloved member of this family who has brought nothing but honor to our name and joy to our lives. Your position as my wife does not give you license to torment others. The transformation in Camilla was complete now. Gone was the sophisticated queen consort who charmed diplomats and graced state occasions with elegance. In her place stood a woman whose mask had been ripped away, exposing years of carefully concealed resentment and jealousy. She's nothing but a commoner who got lucky, Camilla snarled, her voice rising to near hysteria. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. The public may love her little fairy tale, but she'll never be truly royal. The silence that followed her outburst was deafening. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking as the weight of her words settled over the room. She had finally revealed her true feelings about Kate, and there was no taking them back. William's face had gone white with rage, but Kate placed a restraining hand on his arm. Her dignity in that moment was absolute. She refused to be dragged down to Camilla's level even in the face of such vicious attack. Charles stood slowly, his height and bearing making him seem to fill the room. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the full weight of royal authority. I have heard enough, he said simply. More than enough. Camilla seemed to realize what she had done, how completely she had exposed herself. She began to backtrack frantically, her voice becoming shrill with desperation. Charles, you have to understand, I was just trying to protect the institution. I never meant. I was only thinking of what's best for the family. But her words fell into a void. Charles had turned his attention to Kate, his expression gentle and filled with regret. My dear, he said softly, I deeply regret that you have endured this treatment. I failed to protect you when I should have acted immediately upon witnessing the first incident. Kate's tears finally spilled over, not from sadness but from relief. After months of feeling isolated and doubting herself, she finally had validation that the cruelty she had experienced was real and unacceptable. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I thought I was going mad. Camilla's attempts to regain control of the situation grew more frantic. She moved toward Charles, reaching for his arm, but he stepped back with a coldness that spoke volumes about how completely she had destroyed his trust. This isn't over, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're making a terrible mistake, Charles. Choosing her over me will have consequences you can't imagine. But Charles had already made his choice. The silence that had protected Camilla's behavior for too long was finally broken, and nothing she could say would restore it. The aftermath of Camilla's outburst hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally consumed everything in its path. Charles remained standing, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger, while Kate sat quietly beside William, her tears now dried but her hands still trembling slightly from the emotional revelation. Camilla had retreated to the far side of the room, pacing like a caged animal as she realized the full extent of her miscalculation. Years of careful manipulation had been undone in a moment of unguarded fury, and she could see in Charles's face that something fundamental had changed between them forever. You're going to destroy everything, she said, her voice now pleading rather than threatening. The stability we've built, the respect we've earned, all of it will crumble if you continue down this path. Charles closed the portfolio with a decisive snap that echoed through the room. The only thing being destroyed here is a pattern of behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place. William finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled but heavy with emotion. Father, Kate, and I have been discussing the possibility of reducing our royal duties. The environment has become challenging. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had been so focused on maintaining peace that he hadn't realized how close he was to losing his son and daughter-in-law entirely. The thought of Kate withdrawing from public life because of Camilla's cruelty filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. That will not be necessary, Charles said firmly. What will be necessary is ensuring that every member of this family feels safe and respected within these walls. Camilla let out a bitter laugh that contained no humor. safe and respected? She's the most beloved member of the royal family. The press hangs on her every word, the public adores her, and you treat her like she's made of spun glass. What more does she want? Basic human decency, Kate said quietly, speaking up for herself with a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. I never asked for special treatment. I just wanted to do my duty without being constantly reminded that I'm not good enough. The simple honesty of her words seemed to deflate some of Camilla's remaining fight. For a moment, something almost like shame flickered across her features before being quickly replaced by defiance. You have no idea what it's like, Camilla said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. To spend your entire life being compared to a ghost, to know that no matter what you do, you'll always be second choice. And now there's another perfect princess for everyone to worship while I become the villain in their fairy tale. The confession revealed the deep well of insecurity that had driven Camilla's behavior, but Charles felt no sympathy. Understanding someone's pain didn't excuse their cruelty toward others. Your struggles do not justify your treatment of Kate, he said coldly. She has done nothing to deserve your resentment except exist and excel at her duties. Camilla's face hardened again as she realized that her moment of vulnerability had earned her no mercy. So what now? You'll exile me from family gatherings? Reduce my role to ceremonial appearances while you celebrate your precious daughter-in-law. What happens now depends entirely on your actions going forward, Charles replied. But I want to be absolutely clear about something. Kate's position in this family is secure and valued. Any attempt to undermine that will have serious consequences. The threat was delivered with quiet authority that made its sincerity unmistakable. Camilla had pushed too far and revealed too much to ever return to her previous position of subtle influence. William stood up, helping Kate to her feet with gentle solicitude. I think we should go, he said to his father. This has been quite enough drama for one morning. But Charles held up a hand. Please stay. We're not finished here. He moved to his desk and withdrew an official-looking document that made Camilla's eyes widen with alarm. The formality of whatever he was about to present suggested consequences far beyond a simple family argument. I've been giving considerable thought to the structure of royal duties and public responsibilities, Charles said, his tone becoming more official. Recent events have convinced me that some adjustments are necessary. Kate looked puzzled, clearly unaware of what Charles had planned. Even William seemed surprised by this development, though relief was evident in his expression that his father was taking concrete action. Effective immediately, Charles continued, Kate will be taking on additional patronages and representing the crown at several high-profile international events. Her natural grace and intelligence make her an ideal ambassador for British interests. The promotion was a direct rebuke to Camilla's attempts to diminish Kate's role, and everyone in the room understood its significance. Camilla's face went through several expressions: shock, fury, and, finally, calculation as she realized the implications. You're making a mistake, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The press will notice these changes. They'll start asking questions about family dynamics. Let them ask, Charles replied calmly. The truth is that Kate has earned these additional responsibilities through her excellent work. Any other interpretation would be pure speculation. The genius of his approach became clear. He was rewarding Kate publicly while making it impossible for Camilla to object without appearing petty and jealous. The very qualities that had made Camilla effective at psychological warfare now worked against her. Kate looked overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Charles, I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous, but I hope it's not just because of today's discussion. It's not, Charles assured her with genuine warmth. You've earned this recognition through your dedication and talent. Today's conversation simply reminded me that merit should be rewarded rather than undermined. Camilla made one final attempt to regain some control over the situation. Charles, surely we can discuss this privately. Family disagreements shouldn't influence official duties. This was never a family disagreement. Charles cut her off sharply. This was a pattern of deliberate cruelty that I allowed to continue far too long. The discussion is over. The finality in his voice made it clear that no amount of argument or manipulation would change his mind. The protective silence he had maintained around Camilla's behavior had been permanently shattered, replaced by an equally protective barrier around Kate. As the weight of the morning's revelations settled over everyone, the grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking not just another hour but the end of an era in the royal household. The dynamics that had governed their relationships for years had been irrevocably altered, and There would be no going back to the way things were. Camilla stood alone by the window, her reflection showing a woman who had gambled everything on a strategy of psychological dominance and lost completely. The screams of protest that filled her mind could find no voice that would penetrate the wall of protective silence Charles had finally built around his daughter-in-law. The days following the confrontation brought a strange new rhythm to the royal household. Charles had made his position clear, and the effects rippled through every interaction and engagement. Kate walked the corridors with a lighter step, her natural confidence slowly returning as the constant threat of subtle attacks diminished. Camilla had retreated into a calculated silence, appearing at necessary functions with a frozen smile that fooled no one who knew the family dynamics. Her public appearances remained flawless. Years of royal training had taught her to perform even when her private world was crumbling. But, behind closed doors, she moved through the palace like a stranger in her own home. Charles found himself watching Kate with new eyes, marveling at how quickly she began to bloom once the psychological pressure was lifted. At a charity luncheon the following Tuesday, he observed her natural warmth with the guests, the genuine interest she showed in their causes, and the effortless way she made everyone feel valued. It struck him how much of this had been dimmed by months of constant criticism. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" William said quietly, joining his father as they watched Kate speak with a group of young entrepreneurs. "I was starting to worry we might lose her entirely." Charles felt a stab of guilt at his son's words. "You shouldn't have had to carry that burden alone." "I see that now." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Camilla, dressed impeccably as always but carrying herself with a brittleness that hadn't been there before. She moved through the room with practiced efficiency, fulfilling her duties with mechanical precision while maintaining careful distance from Kate. But Charles noticed other things too. The way Camilla's jaw tightened whenever Kate received particular attention from guests, the flash of something dark in her eyes when Kate's laugh rang out across the room, the subtle positioning that ensured they were never photographed together if it could be avoided. Later that evening, as Charles reviewed briefing papers in his study, Camilla appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been waiting for this moment when they would be alone, and her expression suggested she had been preparing for this conversation carefully. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone neutral but her posture tense. Charles looked up from his papers, his expression guarded. "Of course." She entered the room with measured steps, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. When she turned to face him, her mask of composure was perfect, but Charles could see the calculation in her eyes. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," she began, her voice carefully modulated. "Perhaps I was hasty in some of my remarks. The stress of recent weeks has been considerable." It was an opening gambit disguised as an apology, offering an explanation that absolved her of true responsibility while suggesting she was willing to modify her behavior. Charles recognized the strategy immediately. It was the same approach she had used countless times to smooth over previous incidents. "The stress didn't create the problem," Charles replied calmly, not looking up from his papers. "It simply revealed what was already there." Camilla's composure flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. She moved closer to his desk, employing the intimate familiarity of their marriage to create a sense of shared space and mutual understanding. "We've been partners in this impossible job for years," she said, her voice dropping to a more personal register. "Surely we can work through this rough patch without destroying everything we've built together." Charles finally looked up, his gaze steady and unmoved by her appeal. "What exactly do you think we've built, Camilla? Because from where I sit, I see a relationship based on your inability to accept Kate as an equal member of this family." The directness of his response clearly caught her off guard. She had expected negotiation, perhaps some acknowledgement of her own challenges and pressures. Instead, she faced the immovable reality of his changed perspective. "That's not fair," she said, her voice sharpening despite her efforts to remain controlled. "I've tried to help her, to guide her through the complexities of royal life." If she interpreted that as criticism, she interpreted it correctly. Charles interrupted firmly. "As did I, once I finally bothered to pay attention." Camilla's strategy shifted, her approach becoming more desperate as she realized her usual tactics were failing. "Charles, you're letting your guilt cloud your judgment." "Yes, perhaps I could have been more supportive, but destroying our marriage over a few misunderstandings. No one is destroying anything," Charles said quietly. "But I will not allow the pattern of the past months to continue. Kate has my full support and protection going forward." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. She had gambled that their marriage would provide her with sufficient leverage to weather the storm, but Charles was making it clear that his loyalty had shifted irrevocably. "You're choosing her over me," she said, her voice barely controlled. "Your own wife comes second to a woman who's been in this family for just a handful of years." "I'm choosing what's right over what's convenient," Charles corrected. "Something I should have done months ago." The finality in his voice seemed to break something inside Camilla. The careful composure she had maintained since their confrontation cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "She's poisoned you against me," Camilla said, her voice rising dangerously. "That innocent act of hers, the way she makes everyone think she's perfect while I'm the villain, she's manipulated this entire situation." Charles stood up slowly, his full height and authority filling the space between them. "Kate has never said a single word against you. Every action I've taken has been based on my own observations of your behavior." "Then, you're blind," Camilla snapped, abandoning all pretense of reasonableness. "She's calculating every move, playing the victim while positioning herself to take over my role in this family." The accusation was so divorced from reality that Charles almost laughed. Kate's genuine nature was one of her most obvious qualities. She was constitutionally incapable of the kind of manipulation Camilla was describing. "Listen to yourself," he said quietly. "You're describing yourself, not Kate. The calculation, the positioning, the manipulation, those are your methods, not hers." The truth of his words seemed to hit Camilla with devastating force. She stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions before settling on something cold and dangerous. "You'll regret this," she said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When the press starts digging, when people begin asking why the king's wife has been sidelined, when your precious Kate becomes the target of negative coverage, you'll wish you had handled this differently." It was a threat disguised as a prediction, and Charles understood exactly what she was implying. But he also understood that he was past the point of being intimidated by her tactics. "Are you threatening to go to the press?" he asked calmly. Camilla's eyes flashed with something that might have been triumph. "I'm simply pointing out the realities of our situation. I have my own relationships with journalists, my own perspective on recent events." The threat was now explicit, and Charles felt his remaining sympathy for her evaporate completely. She was prepared to damage the institution they both served rather than accept responsibility for her behavior. "Then, you'll discover that I have my own relationships as well," he said quietly, "and my own documentation of events. I suggest you consider very carefully whether you want this private matter to become public." The standoff stretched between them, two people who had shared a marriage but apparently never truly understood each other. Camilla had played her final card, and found it trumped by Charles's quiet resolve. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the bitter taste of complete defeat. "I see. So this is how it ends, with threats and ultimatums instead of any attempt at understanding." "It ends with accountability," Charles corrected, something that should have happened much sooner. As Camilla turned to leave, Charles realized that the woman he had married was disappearing behind a wall of resentment and calculation that might never come down again. The screams of protest and indignation that filled her mind would find no voice that could penetrate the protective silence he had finally chosen to maintain around Kate. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, the transformation within the royal family had become unmistakable to anyone who cared to look closely. Kate moved through her expanded duties with a renewed confidence that seemed to illuminate every room she entered. Her natural warmth, no longer dimmed by constant psychological pressure, had flourished into something that captivated both the public and those who worked closely with the royal household. Charles watched from his position near the grand staircase as Kate greeted a delegation of international visitors with genuine enthusiasm. Her fluency in their language and her obvious preparation for their meeting demonstrated the intelligence and dedication that had always been present but had been systematically undermined for too long. The contrast with the withdrawn, uncertain woman she had begun to become was remarkable. "She's completely transformed," remarked his private secretary, following Charles's gaze. "The confidence she displays now in her public engagements is extraordinary. The press has certainly taken notice." Indeed they had. The newspapers had begun running increasingly positive coverage of Kate's work, noting her growing influence in international relations and her expanding portfolio of charitable causes. What they didn't report, because they couldn't see it, was the personal cost that transformation had required. Camilla had kept her word about not going to the press, but her silence came at the price of an almost complete withdrawal from family life. She maintained her public duties with professional competence. But, behind the scenes, she moved through the palace like a specter of her former self. The vibrant, confident woman who had once commanded rooms with her presence had been replaced by someone who seemed to be performing the role rather than living it. Charles found no satisfaction in her diminishment. He had hoped that removing the toxic dynamic would allow all parties to find a new equilibrium, but Camilla seemed incapable of accepting the changed circumstances. Instead, she had chosen to retreat into a bitter isolation that made every family gathering tense with unspoken recriminations. The weekly family dinner had become a study in careful choreography. Kate and William sat beside Charles, their conversation flowing naturally as they discussed upcoming engagements and shared observations about their work. Camilla occupied the other end of the table, participating minimally and maintaining the frozen smile that had become her default expression. "The children have been asking when they'll see their step-grandmother again," Kate said quietly to Charles during one such dinner. Despite everything that had happened, her concern for family relationships remained genuine. "They don't understand why she seems so distant now." Charles felt the familiar weight of guilt at Kate's words. In protecting her from Camilla's cruelty, he had perhaps created a different kind of damage to the family structure. But when he looked at his grandchildren, bright, happy, secure in their parents' love, he knew he had made the right choice. "Perhaps that's a conversation for another time," he replied gently, glancing toward Camilla, who was pushing food around her plate with mechanical precision. Later, as the family dispersed to their various commitments, Charles found himself alone with William in the library. His son appeared more relaxed than he had in months, but Charles could see lingering concern in his expression. "Father, I need to ask you something," William said, settling into one of the leather armchairs that had belonged to Charles's grandmother. "Are you happy with how things have turned out?" It was a more complex question than it appeared on the surface, touching on marriage, family dynamics, duty, and the personal cost of leadership decisions. Charles considered his response carefully. "I'm satisfied that I finally acted according to my principles," he said finally. "Whether happiness is the appropriate measure for such situations, I'm not certain." William nodded thoughtfully. "Kate is happier than she's been in years. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Charles said firmly. "Watching her retreat into herself was unbearable once I finally acknowledged what was happening." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft knock of a staff member announcing that Camilla was requesting a private audience with Charles. William's expression tightened. These meetings had become increasingly difficult for everyone involved. "I should go," William said, standing. "Give my love to Kate and the children." Charles watched his son leave, marveling at how much stronger their relationship had become since the family crisis. The shared commitment to protecting Kate had created a bond between father and son that hadn't existed before. When Camilla arrived, Charles was struck by how much she seemed to have aged in just 6 months. The stress of her changed circumstances had left visible marks, lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't entirely conceal, a brittleness in her movements that spoke of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. "I wanted to discuss the arrangements for next month's state visit," she said, her tone carefully professional. But Charles could see through the pretense. This wasn't about arrangements. It was another attempt to negotiate her way back into the influence she had lost. They had had versions of this conversation dozens of times, each one ending with her frustration and his unwavering position. "The arrangements are finalized," he said gently but firmly. "Kate will be handling the primary hosting duties, as we discussed." Camilla's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger that simmered constantly beneath her professional facade. "I am your wife and the queen consort. Being relegated to secondary roles at state functions is humiliating. You're being asked to participate according to your strengths," Charles replied. "Kate has demonstrated exceptional skill at international relations. It makes sense to utilize her talents." "Her talents," Camilla repeated bitterly. "You mean her ability to charm everyone into forgetting that she was a commoner who got lucky enough to catch a prince's eye?" The familiar refrain of resentment revealed that nothing had really changed in Camilla's fundamental perspective. 6 months of consequences had not led to any genuine reflection or growth, only a deeper entrenchment in victimhood and blame. "I mean her intelligence, her preparation, and her genuine interest in the people she meets," Charles said quietly. "Qualities that serve the crown well." Camilla stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her calculating whether to make another appeal or unleash the fury that was clearly building inside her. In the end, she chose silence, perhaps recognizing that any outburst would only confirm his assessment of her character. As she turned to leave, Charles felt a profound sadness for what their marriage had become. He had genuinely loved Camilla once, had admired her strength and intelligence. But her inability to accept Kate as an equal had poisoned everything between them, creating a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. That evening, Charles stood again at his study window, watching Kate play with her children in the garden below. Their laughter carried up through the evening air, a sound that had become more frequent as the atmosphere in the household improved. William stood beside his wife, his arm around her waist. Both of them relaxed in a way that had been impossible when every family interaction was a potential minefield. The choice Charles had made, to break his protective silence around Camilla's behavior and extend it instead to Kate, had cost him his marriage in any meaningful sense. But watching his daughter-in-law flourish, seeing his son's relief, and knowing his grandchildren were growing up in an environment free from psychological warfare, he knew he would make the same choice again. Camilla's screams of protest, whether voiced or silent, could no longer penetrate the barrier he had built around Kate. The stand he had finally taken had changed everything, and there would be no going back to the way things were. In the end, that was exactly as it should be. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another evening in a household where love had finally triumphed over manipulation, and where protecting the innocent had become more important than preserving a false peace. Charles closed his eyes and listened to his family's laughter, knowing that some silences were worth breaking, no matter the personal cost.